15% of the people on this planet are carrying something in their blood that should not exist. Not by the rules of evolution, not by the patterns of primate biology, not by any straightforward reading of how living things change over time and why. Something is missing in their blood that is present in every other great ape on Earth. Every chimpanzee, every gorilla, every orangutan, and every monkey species that researchers have ever examined. All of them carry a specific protein on the surface of their red blood cells, but roughly 1 in 7 human beings does not. And after more than 80 years of study, with tools and techniques that can read individual molecules from ancient bones buried for tens of thousands of years, no one has been able to fully explain why. This is not a small biological footnote. This is not some minor variation the way hair color differs or height varies across populations. This is a difference in something so fundamental, so close to the core of what a cell is, that it changes how a pregnant woman's immune system responds to her own unborn child. It changes which blood can safely flow, through which veins. It clusters in specific places on the map of the world in ways that don't fit the simple story of random mutation drifting through populations. It concentrates in populations that are already strange in other ways. People who speak languages that don't belong to any known language family. People who live in mountain strongholds and coastal edges, where the long waves of migration that reshape the rest of humanity somehow passed over them. And in the oldest texts that human beings ever wrote down, pressed into clay tablets in the first cities that ever existed, there are descriptions of beings who came from above and walked among people. Beings with knowledge, beings with power, beings who left something behind in the blood of their descendants that marked certain lineages as different, as connected to a source the ordinary world could not see. The ancient Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. And the question that sits quietly at the center of this story, the question that no one has answered cleanly in 80 years of blood science, is whether the memory preserved in those clay tablets is mythology, or whether it is something else. Welcome. Settle wherever you are. Let the night hold the edges of the room. And let this story take you somewhere between what science can measure and what the oldest human memories are still trying to say. Where are you listening from tonight? Whatever city or village or quiet house is outside your window, it sits on ground that has been walked by human beings for longer than any written record can reach. And the blood moving through your body right now carries, in its particular chemistry, a faint signal from every one of those generations. A message, written in protein and antigen, and the small specific details of how your cells present themselves to the world. The Rh factor was discovered in 1940, not because anyone was looking for it specifically, but because 2 researchers named Karl Landsteiner and Alexander Wiener were doing something that sounded routine. They were injecting blood from rhesus macaque monkeys into rabbits and guinea pigs and watching the immune response. When they then tested the antibodies the animals produced against samples of human blood, they found something they did not expect. The antibodies reacted with roughly 85% of the human samples, causing the red blood cells to clump together in the pattern that signals an immune attack. But 15% of the human samples showed no reaction at all. Those cells were, in effect, invisible to the antibodies, as if something that should have been on their surface was simply absent. Landsteiner named the factor after the rhesus monkeys. If you carried the protein, you were Rh positive. If you didn't, you were Rh negative. A clean, my simple classification for what turned out to be one of the most complicated puzzles in human biology. Because here is what made no sense from the first moment anyone thought carefully about it. The rhesus protein was not a minor variation. Virtually all mammals carried some version of it. It was ancient, deeply conserved across millions of years of evolution. Primates had it. Dogs had it. Even distant mammalian relatives carried similar proteins. The protein was not some recent innovation that some populations had and others had not yet developed. It was part of the baseline, part of what a mammalian red blood cell was supposed to look like. So why didn't 15% of humans have it? And why, once researchers began systematically mapping that 15% across the world, did the pattern look nothing like the random scatter of a simple mutation? Why was it concentrated so heavily in one specific corner of the planet, among one specific group of people, in numbers that had no business being that high if this was just an ordinary genetic accident? The Basque people of northern Spain and southern France carry Rh-negative blood at rates between 30 and 35%. 1 in 3 Basques, in a world where the global average is 15%, and where most of Asia and Africa and the indigenous Americas register at 1% or less. That number is extraordinary. That is not drift. That is not coincidence. That is a signature. Something happened in this population, or to this population, or was preserved by this population, that does not fit any simple explanation. And the Basques are not just unusual for their blood. They are unusual in almost every way that makes a population distinct. Their language, which they call Euskara, has no known relatives. Linguists have been trying to classify it for over a century. They have compared it to Caucasian languages, to ancient Iberian scripts, to languages from North Africa, to theoretical reconstructions of pre-Indo-European tongues. Nothing fits. Euskara stands alone, a linguistic island surrounded by languages that all belong to the same vast Indo-European family that swept across Europe thousands of years ago, replacing nearly every indigenous tongue in its path. Except this one, as if the Basques were already there, already speaking something from a time before the migrations, already carrying their unusual blood in a place where the waves of history somehow flowed around them rather than through them. This is the shape of the mystery, not a single anomaly, but a convergence of anomalies. A blood type that shouldn't exist at those frequencies, a language that belongs to no family, a population that genetics suggests has been largely isolated for far longer than most European populations. Mountain people, Atlantic coast people, people who survived as a distinct genetic pool while empires rose and fell and new waves of humanity poured across the land around them. If you look deeper at the geography, the pattern extends outward from the Basque heartland in a gradient that tells its own story, moving west from the Pyrenees into the rest of Spain and Portugal. Rh-negative frequencies drop somewhat but remain elevated compared to global averages. Moving north into France, especially into Brittany and Normandy, the same. Moving further north to Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Celtic fringe of the Atlantic, frequencies sit around 25%. High. Consistently high. As if these populations along the western edge of Europe all share some ancient common thread, some genetic heritage from a time before the populations we know as historical Europeans arrived and mixed and changed the landscape. Then the gradient falls as you move east and south. Germany, Poland, Russia, further east into Asia, further south into Africa, and the indigenous Americas, the frequency drops steadily towards zero. In most of sub-Saharan Africa, H-negative blood is so rare that when researchers find it in modern populations, they generally assume it arrived with European contact during the colonial period. It was not there before. This is the map, high in the far west of Europe, negligible almost everywhere else. And the question the map asks is one that mainstream genetics has answered only partially. Random mutation, genetic drift in small isolated populations, the fact that the Atlantic fringe was least affected by the eastward migrations that reshaped European genetics over the last 10,000 years. This explains some of the pattern. It does not explain all of it. It does not explain why a mutation that causes potentially fatal complications during pregnancy persisted and reached 35% in one population, rather than being gradually eliminated the way natural selection is supposed to eliminate traits that reduce reproductive success. It does not explain the specific geographic alignment with populations that are unusual in other ways, and it does not explain a connection that some researchers have quietly noted for decades between the places where Rh-negative blood is most common and the places where the oldest surviving memories of beings who were not quite ordinary humans are preserved. The truth may be something we have not yet found the right tools to measure. Let the thought settle quietly for a moment. The Sumerians, who built the first cities in the river valleys of what is now southern Iraq, left behind more than 200,000 clay tablets, the oldest writing in the world. And woven through those tablets, from the earliest layers of the archive, is a consistent account of beings called the Anunnaki. The word translates, depending on which reading you follow, as those who came from the sky to earth, or as the great ones who descended from the heavens. They appear in the texts not as vague forces of nature personified into gods, but as specific beings with names and personalities and areas of authority. Beings who argued with each other, who made decisions and sometimes regretted them, who held councils, who had subordinates. Enki, the lord of deep wisdom and the underground waters, keeper of the me, the foundational technologies of civilization. Enlil, who commanded winds and sky, and the authority of heaven over earth. Anu, the highest, the one whose name simply meant sky or heaven. Inanna, the great queen associated with the brightest point in the night sky, who in one ancient text travels to Enki's domain, specifically to acquire the me and bring their gifts to her city. The me is one of the most interesting concepts in all of Sumerian literature. Usually translated as divine laws or cosmic principles, the word encompasses the entire technology base of civilization. Agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, the arts of metalworking and navigation, the principles of kingship and priesthood. In the Sumerian understanding, these things were not invented by humans through long trial and error. They were given. They were transmitted from beings who already possessed them to a humanity that was being shaped and guided. Modern scholars treat this as mythology, as the universal human tendency to explain the origins of culture by attributing it to supernatural sources, to gods or ancestors or sky beings, rather than acknowledging the slow, grinding work of ordinary human ingenuity across generations. And perhaps that is all it is. But what if the stories came before the mythology? What if the Anunnaki, whatever they were in the original memory that the earliest Sumerians were trying to preserve, represented something real that had been encountered in human prehistory? Something that left a mark not only in stories but in blood. The Sumerian king list, one of the most studied ancient texts in existence, names the kings who ruled in sequence from before the flood to after. For the post-flood kings, the reigns are measured in decades and centuries, human scales of time. For the pre-flood kings, the numbers are incomprehensible. Reigns of 28,000 years, of 36,000 years. Numbers so far beyond any human lifespan that every scholar who has encountered them has concluded they must be symbolic, must represent something other than literal solar years. But what if they are not measuring years? The Sumerians worked in a base 60 mathematical system, not the base 10 system modern cultures use. The same system that gave us 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, 360 degrees in a circle. These numbers had astronomical meaning. They were built from observation of the sky over very long periods. What if the impossibly long reigns in the king list are measuring astronomical cycles, great years, precessions of the equinox, vast spans of celestial time that made perfect sense to a civilization that understood the sky as both clock and calendar? What if the kings before the flood were not individual humans ruling for geological epochs, but institutions, lineages, continuities of preserved knowledge, maintained across periods of time that a single human life could not span? And what if those lineages left something in the biology of the people they taught? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally, in the blood. The Nephilim appear in the book of Genesis in a passage that is brief and strange and has generated more commentary than almost any other fragment of religious text in history. The sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty ones who were of old, the men of renown. The Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also after that. Who were the sons of God? The Hebrew term used is Bene Elohim, which could be translated as divine beings, or sons of the gods, or beings of heavenly origin. The text does not explain them. They appear, they mate with human women. Their children become the Nephilim, and then the flood comes and nearly everything is destroyed. The Nephilim themselves are described as giants in the older translations, as mighty men in others. The word in Hebrew suggests something like the fallen ones or the falling ones, which may refer to their origin from above, or to their fate in the destruction that followed. They are clearly presented as something between the divine and the human, as the product of a crossing that should not have happened, or perhaps that happened by design. Now consider the pregnancy paradox at the center of the Rh negative story. An Rh negative mother, carrying an Rh positive child, inheriting the father's antigen, can develop antibodies that cross the placenta and attack the fetus's blood. The mother's immune system, one of the most sophisticated biological defense mechanisms that evolution ever produced, treats her own unborn child as a foreign invader. It makes no evolutionary sense. Nature is extraordinarily precise about protecting offspring. Maternal instinct, maternal immune tolerance for the fetus, the careful biological negotiation that allows a mother to carry a genetically distinct child without rejecting it, all of this is among the most refined machinery in mammalian biology. And in Rh incompatible pregnancies, it fails. Not occasionally, not in edge cases. It fails predictably, reproducibly, whenever an Rh negative woman carries an Rh positive child and has previously been exposed to Rh positive blood. The antibodies form. They remember. And in subsequent pregnancies, they attack. What if this is not a flaw in the system, but a record of a crossing? What if Rh negative blood represents, in some sense, a different origin? Not alien in the science fiction sense, but genuinely distinct in a biological sense. The way two populations that evolved separately for long enough develop incompatibilities. The way a hybrid between two sufficiently divergent lineages carries biological tensions that pure lineages do not. This is a thought that mainstream genetics does not entertain formally, because the tools of modern genomics do not support it in the forms that ancient texts seem to suggest. But the tools of modern genomics are also working from incomplete data. The ancient DNA record for most of the world most of the time is thin. We have snapshots where we need a film. We can see that Rh negative variants are relatively recent on an evolutionary timescale, probably tens of thousands of years old, rather than hundreds of thousands. But relatively recent on an evolutionary timescale still covers an enormous amount of human prehistory. And the fact that the trait persists, that it continues to be carried at high frequencies in specific populations, despite the reproductive cost, suggests that something in the equation is not yet fully understood. Let the night hold that question for a moment. Not with anxiety, but with the particular quality of attention that the space between waking and sleep makes possible. The state in which things too subtle for daylight thinking become audible. The royal families of Europe had what they called blue blood. The Spanish aristocracy used the term sangre azul, referring to the pale skin of the Castilian nobility, through which blue veins were visible, supposedly proving they had not mixed with darker-skinned populations. But the obsession with blood purity among European royal families went far beyond aesthetics. They believed something fundamental ran through their veins, something that justified their authority, something that made them, in a genuine rather than merely political sense, different. They may have been more right than they understood, and in ways that would have horrified them. When researchers began systematically analyzing the blood of European royalty in the 20th century, they found elevated frequencies of Rh negative blood in several dynastic families compared to the general populations those families had ruled for centuries, not universal, not a majority even within royal lines, but statistically notable. Enough to be worth examining. These families had practiced deliberate endogamy, marriage within a restricted pool, for generations. The stated reason was the preservation of bloodline purity, and of whatever quality they believed made them distinct. The biological result was the concentration of whatever traits, beneficial and harmful alike, happened to be present in the founding genetic pool. If an early member of a dynasty happened to be Rh negative, several generations of cousin marriages would predictably drive that frequency upward simply through mathematics. But here is the detail that connects to the Anunnaki story more directly. The European royal families were not simply claiming social superiority, they were claiming genealogical connection to something divine. The divine right of kings was not just political theory, it was, in its original form, a literal claim. These families believed they descended from gods, from heroes, from beings who were not entirely of ordinary human stock. The French monarchy traced itself through Frankish kings who traced themselves back to Troy, which in mythological memory connected to the gods. The English royal house claimed descent from Brutus of Troy, and through him from the divine lineage of Rome. Every European royal house had its own version of this story, its own account of the moment where the purely human lineage connected to something beyond it. And in the ancient Near East, where civilization began, and where the Anunnaki texts were first written down, the same structure appears. The Sumerian king list presents kingship itself as something that descended from heaven. The institution of rule was not invented by humans, it was lowered from the sky. And the first kings, the pre-flood rulers, with their impossibly long reigns, were explicitly connected to the Anunnaki. What were these families trying to preserve? What genetic legacy were they protecting across centuries of careful, deliberate inbreeding? If it was merely power they sought to preserve, any sufficiently large noble class would have served. The fact that specific bloodlines were maintained with such extreme care, at such high biological cost, the haemophilia, the Habsburg jaw, the extraordinary rates of stillbirth and infant death in these families, suggests something more was being attempted than simple political continuity. The haemophilia that Queen Victoria carried and spread through the royal houses of Europe is one of the most dramatic examples of what happens when a small founding genetic pool reproduces with itself for too many generations. Her great-grandson Alexei Romanov, heir to the Russian throne, suffered from haemophilia B, which prevented his blood from clotting normally. Even minor cuts or bruises could become life-threatening hemorrhages. His parents, Tsar Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra, in their desperation to find relief for their son's constant suffering, became dependent on a Siberian mystic named Rasputin, who appeared to be able to ease the boy's bleeding episodes through what was probably hypnosis and stress reduction. Rasputin's influence over the Russian royal family became the symbol of a monarchy that had lost its connection to reality. His presence, a peasant mystic with apparent power over the health of the future Tsar, crystallized in the public imagination the decadence and dysfunction of the Romanov court. His assassination in 1916 came too late. Within weeks, the revolution began. Within months, Nicholas abdicated. And in a basement in Yekaterinburg in the summer of 1918, the entire family was executed. Alexei was 13 years old, a single genetic trait, carried unknowingly by a woman who ruled the most powerful empire on earth, transmitted through strategic royal marriages to every major throne in Europe, contributed to the collapse of dynasties and the redrawing of the map of the modern world. This is the power of blood. Not mystical power, biochemical, molecular, cellular power. The power of a single protein present or absent from the surface of a red blood cell. But the question the Rh negative story keeps returning to is a different one. Not what damage concentrated bloodlines can do, which is well understood. The question is what advantage, if any, kept Rh negative blood in the population at all. Natural selection is not subtle about removing traits that kill babies. Hemolytic disease of the newborn, the condition where an Rh negative mother's antibodies cross the placenta and destroy an Rh positive fetus's blood cells, was not a minor inconvenience in the pre-medical world. It killed infants. It killed them in numbers large enough that the pattern was known and recognized, even when the mechanism was completely mysterious. Parish records from medieval Europe are full of notations about families where the second or third child was born, swollen and yellow, and dead within hours. Families where healthy first children were followed by a string of losses, each pregnancy more dangerous than the last, until the pattern itself became a kind of folk knowledge, a dread that attached to certain lineages, a whisper that some families were cursed. For a trait this costly to persist at 15% of the global population, and at 35% in specific isolates, something was compensating for it. Some advantage, some protection, some benefit that made carrying this unusual blood type worth the reproductive cost in environments where the cost was real and immediate. Several candidates have been proposed over the decades: enhanced immune response to certain pathogens, resistance to specific parasites, subtle differences in how the immune system calibrates itself that might have provided protection during historical epidemics now long forgotten. Some studies have suggested connections between Rh status and susceptibility to toxoplasmosis, a parasitic infection that can have serious effects during pregnancy and that appears to behave differently in Rh negative versus Rh positive individuals. Other research has pointed toward possible differences in immune regulation, in inflammatory responses, in the particular way Rh negative immune systems distinguish between self and other. None of these connections are fully established. The data is fragmentary, contested, difficult to replicate, but they point in a consistent direction. The Rh negative immune system is not simply a system with one protein missing. It may be a system configured somewhat differently in ways that are still being mapped. And this brings the story back to the Anunnaki and to a reading of the ancient text that most scholars would not accept, but that the questions raised by the blood keep making relevant. Sing, if the Anunnaki were not simply mythological figures, but represented some real encounter in human prehistory, whether that encounter was with a more advanced human civilization now lost beneath the sea, whether it was with a lineage of anatomically modern humans that had evolved somewhat separately before mixing with the populations that became the first Sumerians, whether it was with something that the current scientific framework does not have a category for, then what they left behind in the blood of the people they encountered would not necessarily be something visible or dramatic. It would be molecular. It would be in the specific configuration of proteins on the surface of cells. It would be in the particular way an immune system learned to distinguish between self and the stranger it once encountered. It would be, perhaps, exactly what we find: a missing protein. A geographic concentration in the places where the oldest pre-agricultural populations survived the longest in isolation. A reproductive paradox that suggests two distinct biological origins coming into contact. A persistence across thousands of years, despite the biological cost, suggesting that whatever the advantage was, it was real and significant enough to offset that cost in the environments where it was maintained. The truth may be something we cannot yet reach cleanly with the tools we currently have. Ancient DNA is fragmentary. The populations who carried Rh negative blood in deepest prehistory are poorly represented in the skeletal record. The Basques themselves, whose living genetics are the best window we have into those ancient European populations, always have only been studied systematically for a few decades, and the specific questions about Rh factor distribution in pre-agricultural Europe have barely been asked in the systematic way that would be needed to answer them. But the shape of the mystery is visible. The pattern is there. And in the quiet space of a night like this one, when the analytical mind relaxes and something else becomes possible, it is worth sitting with the full strangeness of it. Let me ask you something, and you can let the answer form without words, the way things form in the space before sleep. If 1 in 7 people on Earth carries blood that differs from all other great apes in a way that has never been fully explained, that causes biological complications suggesting 2 different origins coming into contact, that concentrates in populations that are themselves ancient and unusual and isolated, and that is mentioned in the mythology of the oldest civilizations as a marker of divine connection. What is the most honest thing to say about what we know? The most honest thing is that we don't know. That the scientific tools available have mapped the what without yet finding the why. That the absence of a confirmed explanation is not the same as confirmation that no unusual explanation exists. And that the history of science is full of moments when the thing that seemed impossible turned out to be real in some form that had simply not been recognized yet. This is not an invitation to believe without evidence. It is an invitation to hold the question with the seriousness it deserves, which mainstream science has sometimes been reluctant to do, not because of bad faith, but because the questions touch areas where rigor becomes difficult and where less careful thinkers have sometimes made claims that discredit the entire inquiry. The careful claim is this: Rh, negative blood, exists. Its geographic distribution is unusual and not fully explained. The reproductive paradox it creates suggests two distinct populations coming into contact. The populations where it is most concentrated are the populations with the deepest unbroken roots in pre-migration Europe. The oldest written accounts of human origins describe contact between humans and beings of different origin who left something behind in human biology. These facts belong together in the same inquiry. Whether the answer they point to is a prehistoric contact between two human lineages, a surviving remnant of a pre-flood civilization, something the current scientific framework would recognize, or something it would not, remains genuinely open. In modern medicine, the story of Rh negative blood is more practical and more urgent than any of this ancient material. Every emergency room in the world with a blood bank has a shelf, often a specific shelf, treated with particular care, holding units of O negative blood. O negative is the emergency reserve, the type that can be given to almost any patient in a crisis when there is no time to determine the patient's specific type, because O negative carries neither the A nor B antigens of the system and also lacks the Rhd antigen. It presents to most immune systems as the least threatening possible option. In the critical minutes when someone is bleeding heavily and the clock is running, O negative saves lives. But this universal usefulness comes with a constant logistical problem. Rh negative blood is rare, in populations where it runs at 15% of the global average and at far lower frequencies across most of Africa and Asia. The supply is chronically tight. Blood banks track their Rh negative inventory the way a careful person tracks a dwindling resource in uncertain times. They know how fast it is used, how long it takes to replace, and what it would mean to run out at the wrong moment. Rh negative donors are a small, perpetually in-demand minority. They carry in their bodies a resource that is disproportionately useful to the medical system and disproportionately difficult to replace. When a pregnant woman who is Rh negative miscarries and needs a transfusion, it must be Rh negative blood. When a child with no known blood type is rushed into surgery, it will often be O negative blood that saves them. When a disaster fills the emergency wards faster than blood typing can happen, the O negative shelf is what makes the difference between those who survive and those who don't. And since 1968, when doctors developed a treatment called Rh immunoglobulin, the pregnancy paradox itself has largely been solved in countries with access to modern healthcare. The treatment is elegantly simple in concept. If you can prevent an Rh negative mother from ever developing antibodies against the Rhd antigen, you prevent the cascade that leads to hemolytic disease of the newborn. This is done by giving her a dose of pre-made antibodies shortly after the birth of an Rh positive child. These pre-made antibodies quickly bind to any fetal blood cells that entered her circulation during delivery, coating them before her immune system can encounter and memorize the foreign antigen. They disappear naturally, taking the targeted cells with them, and the mother's immune system never learns to recognize Rhd as an enemy. In the decades since this treatment became standard practice, deaths from hemolytic disease of the newborn dropped by more than 90% in countries where it was widely available. Families that had lost child after child to something they couldn't understand or prevent could suddenly have healthy pregnancies without unusual risk. The ancient paradox, or the one that had quietly shaped the lives of Rh incompatible families, for as long as Rh-negative blood had existed in human populations, was addressed, if not entirely solved, by a small injection. But the existence of the solution does not dissolve the questions the paradox raised. Why did evolution allow this incompatibility to persist? What was the selection pressure that kept Rh-negative blood in the population despite its cost? If the answer is simply that genetic drift in small isolated populations can maintain traits that would otherwise be eliminated, why do we find those traits at 35% in one specific population? Drift can explain rare traits. It does not easily explain common ones. Something maintained this blood type. Something made it worth the biological cost in the environments where it became established. And we have not yet found that something, not convincingly, not in a way, that closes the question. The Berbers of North Africa are worth noting here because they represent a convergence of strangeness similar to the Basque case. Among Berber populations in Morocco and Algeria, researchers have found Rh-negative frequencies significantly higher than in surrounding populations. Not as high as among the Basques, but high enough to stand out against the near-zero baseline of sub-Saharan Africa and the low figures of the broader Middle East and North Africa. The Berbers, like the Basques, speak a language that predates the major migrations that shape the region they live in. Like the Basques, they have cultural traditions suggesting very deep roots, with a continuity stretching back before the waves of migration and conquest that gave the Mediterranean world its current genetic and linguistic character. The Berbers are the indigenous people of North Africa. They were there before the Arab conquest in the 7th century. They were there before the Roman conquest before that. They were there, in some form, before the Phoenicians who built Carthage, before the Greeks who colonized the coastal cities. Deep, old, continuous. And they carry elevated Rh-negative blood in a region where elevated Rh-negative blood makes no geographic or migration-based sense unless it represents the survival of something very ancient, or even something that was once more widespread, and that the later migrations diluted everywhere except in the mountain refuges and the isolated coastal communities where people stayed put and the new waves flowed around them. This is the interpretation that has the most support in conventional genetics. Pre-agricultural Europeans, and perhaps pre-agricultural North Africans, carried Rh-negative blood at frequencies we can only see now in the populations that remained most isolated from the later migrations. The Basques most of all, the Irish and Scots and Welsh of the Atlantic fringe, the mountain Berbers of the Atlas ranges. These populations are like pockets where something older survived while everything around them changed. But this interpretation, even if correct, still leaves the deepest question unresolved. Where did the pre-agricultural Europeans get it? How did it reach those frequencies in those populations before the agricultural migrations reshaped everything? And what was it doing in those populations that made it advantageous enough to persist? The Ice Age is one answer that has been proposed. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20 to 25,000 years ago, Europe was cold and harsh, and the human populations living there were small, scattered, under constant pressure from the climate. Small populations under strong selective pressure can change genetically very fast. A trait that provided even a small survival advantage in Ice Age Europe could have risen from a rare mutation to significant frequency in just a few thousand years. If Rh-negative blood provided some protection against a disease that was common then and rare now, or some advantage in the specific immune environment of Ice Age Europe that no longer exists, it could have become established in those populations and persisted afterward simply because the populations that maintained it continued to survive. This is plausible. It fits the data we have, and it is incomplete in the way that the most honest scientific answers often are. Plausible is not confirmed, fits is not explains, and the specific nature of whatever advantage Ice Age Europeans might have gained from this unusual blood type remains unknown. Meanwhile, the cultural material keeps pointing, not as proof, but as persistent suggestion. The old stories of the Celts, To the people of the Atlantic fringe who now carry some of the highest Rh negative frequencies in the world outside the Basque country, are saturated with accounts of beings who are not quite ordinary humans. The Tuath de Danann of Irish mythology, the fair folk of Scottish tradition, the Tylwyth Teg of Wales. These were not the clumsy giants or malevolent monsters of other mythological traditions. They were described as beautiful, as possessing knowledge and abilities beyond ordinary humans, as being connected to a different order of time, a different relationship with the physical world. And they were described as having interbred with humans, as having left their characteristics in specific lineages, as having created families that were partly of one kind and partly of another. These stories have been studied as mythology, or as the personification of natural forces, as the preserved memory of encounters between different human populations as the Celts expanded across Europe and encountered earlier inhabitants. All of these interpretations may contain something real. The mythological layer may have grown over a historical memory, the way sediment grows over ancient structures, obscuring the shape while preserving the fact of the thing beneath. And the thing beneath may be this. At some point in the deep past of northwestern Europe, in the populations that would eventually become the Basques and the Irish and the Scots and the Welsh, there was a biological encounter. Two lineages met. One carried the RHD antigen. One did not. Their children carried the memory of that crossing in the incompatibility between their blood, in the complications of pregnancy, dark in the particular immune configuration that has fascinated and puzzled researchers ever since 1940. The beings in the stories were the other lineage. Not gods in the theological sense, not extraterrestrials in the science fiction sense, but something that human memory could only encode in the language it had available, the language of the divine, the otherworldly, the beings from above or below or beyond, who were recognizably similar to humans but recognizably distinct, and whose mixing with ordinary humanity left a mark that persists to this day in the blood of the people who live where those oldest stories were first told. This is speculation. It may be wrong, but it is speculation in a direction that the data points, and that is different from speculation in the direction that wishful thinking points. The mystery is real. See, the geographic pattern is real. The pregnancy paradox is real. The ancient texts describing contact between human beings and beings of different origin are real, whatever interpretation we give them. These things belong together in the same inquiry, and that inquiry is not finished. Let me ask you something. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the time is, whatever the world outside your window looks like, have you ever felt like something in you came from somewhere that no ordinary account of your history explains? Not a mystical feeling, not a belief, but a specific, quiet sense that the lineage you carry is longer and stranger than the family tree you can see. If you are Rh negative, that feeling may have a molecular basis that science is still working toward understanding. If you are Rh positive, the same question applies in different form, because the other people in your family tree, the ones who mixed with your ancestors at some point in the deep past, who contributed some of what you carry, were not all the same. The genetic record of every human being alive today is an archive of meetings and crossings and encounters that stretch back further than any name or story has yet reached. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, what part of the world you carry in your particular combination of blood and bone and memory. It matters in ways that science is only beginning to understand. The people who carry Rh negative blood in their veins right now are not special in the sense of being better than others. This is important, and it is different from what some of the more colourful theories about Rh negative blood claim. There are no superpowers. There is no confirmed elevated intelligence. The scattered studies suggesting unusual sensitivity, unusual eye colour, unusual cognitive patterns have not held up in the large controlled trials that would be needed to take them seriously. But there is something worth acknowledging. Rh negative individuals carry a biological marker that represents the deepest human questions about our origins and our diversity. They carry it in the one material that is simultaneously the most intimate and the most universal part of every living body. Blood is what makes us the same kind of thing. And the variation within blood is what tells the story of everything that made us different from each other. The pregnancy paradox, the geographic mystery, the ancient texts, and the inability of any simple explanation to fully account for all of it are a coherent signal. They are pointing at something. The direction they point is toward a deep past in which human beings were not the single continuous lineage that the simplest version of our origin story suggests, but a complex of populations, some more isolated than others, some carrying genetic configurations that arose in specific environments under specific pressures and that left marks that are still with us, and the cultures that grew up in the places where these unusual bloodlines were most concentrated, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Celts in the Atlantic west of Europe, the Berbers in the mountains of North Africa. All of them preserved memories of a time before the present order. It was a time when the connection between the ordinary world and something beyond it was direct and immediate. When beings of different origin walked among people and taught them and mixed with them and left something in their descendants that the descendants could feel but could not fully name. What they left may be this: a specific protein, absent from the surface of specific red blood cells, a quiet signal from a very old crossing, a mark that persists because whatever advantage it once conferred was real enough to survive the cost it imposed, a mystery that 80 years of the most sophisticated biological science in human history has not yet resolved. And tonight, somewhere on this small planet, 1 in 7 people is lying in the dark with that mystery circulating through their veins. The same blood that puzzled Landsteiner and Wiener in 1940, the same blood that the Basques have carried in the mountains between Spain and France since before recorded history began, the same blood that appears, perhaps, in whatever it was that the Sumerians were describing when they wrote about the Anunnaki and the gifts they brought from beyond the sky. The night is quiet, the questions are large, and the blood keeps moving, as it has for however long it has been this particular kind of blood, through the hearts of the people who carry it, unaware of its own strangeness, simply doing what blood does, carrying the oxygen that keeps thinking possible, maintaining the warmth that makes life feel like life, connecting the present moment, this particular breath, this particular night, to a past so long and so full of crossings and encounters and meetings between different kinds of humans that no story we currently tell about ourselves is big enough to hold it all. But the mystery holds it. The unanswered question holds it. And the blood holds it, cell by cell, heartbeat by heartbeat, generation by generation, in the quiet persistence of something that refuses to be fully explained. Let the questions rest now. Let the blood do its work in silence. The stars outside your window, or the city lights, or the dark shapes of trees. All of it is part of the same long story. The one that began before there were words for it. The one that is still being written. You are part of that story. Whatever your blood type is, whatever the particular configuration of proteins on the surface of your red blood cells, you are a single chapter in something that is much longer and much stranger than any account of it that has yet been written down. The blood knows, even if the mind forgets by morning. Sleep well. The science of blood did not begin with Landsteiner. It began much earlier, in the collective human awareness that blood was different from other substances, that it carried something more than oxygen and iron and plasma proteins. Every ancient civilization that left written records treated blood as special, as sacred, as the seat of life in a way that went beyond the mechanical. The Sumerians used blood in ritual contexts that their texts describe as communication with the divine. The Egyptians had elaborate understandings of blood in both medical and religious frameworks. The Hebrews were forbidden from consuming blood in food, because blood was understood to carry the life of the creature, the nephesh, the animating principle, something that did not belong to the person eating, but to the source of creation. These were not primitive misunderstandings of biology that modern science has corrected. They were intuitions about something real, that modern science is still in the process of understanding in molecular detail. Blood carries more information than oxygen and nutrients. It carries immune memory. It carries the specific molecular record of every pathogen a person has ever encountered and survived. It carries hormonal signals that affect mood and cognition and the capacity for connection. It carries genetic information in the cells and chemical information in the plasma in ways that researchers are still cataloging. And in a more fundamental sense, blood carries evolutionary history. The specific configuration of proteins on the surface of red blood cells is a record of the pressures and encounters and adaptations that a particular lineage survived on its way to the present moment. When we look at those surface proteins and find something missing that every other primate has, we are looking at a chapter in that history, a chapter that begins, at minimum, tens of thousands of years ago, in a population that was already distinct before it became the Basques or the pre-agricultural Europeans or whoever first carried this particular absence in their cells. The absence is the evidence. The hole in the pattern is the clue. Some of the most important discoveries in the history of science have come from noticing absences rather than presences. The gap in the periodic table that told Mendeleev that elements not yet discovered must exist. The missing mass in galaxies that pointed toward dark matter. The silence in a signal where expected frequencies should have appeared. What is not there can tell you as much about what happened as what is. The missing RHD antigen tells us that at some point a population existed in which not having this protein was advantageous enough, or at minimum not disadvantageous enough, to become common. A population in which the reproductive cost was either not yet realized or was outweighed by something else. A population that then mixed with populations that did carry the antigen, creating the incompatibility that makes Rh negative status clinically significant in the modern world. The question of what that original population was and what its relationship was to the other populations it eventually encountered is the question that remains open. The question that the Sumerian texts, interpreted one way, seem to be answering in the only language available to people 10,000 years ago when they sat down to record what their traditions preserved from even deeper history. They were describing the meeting, the crossing, the moment when the bloodlines that had been separate came together and left in their descendants both a gift and a complication, a configuration of blood that would thousands of years later confuse researchers who expected human biology to follow the same patterns as every other primate, a configuration that would eventually be discovered to matter in pregnancy, in transfusion, in the subtle landscape of immune response that researchers are still mapping. In the Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are described as having created or shaped human beings specifically for purposes connected to their own civilization. The word used in the most famous of these passages, from the Enuma Elish and from various tablet versions of the creation account, describes a making or a fashioning that involved mixing, a new kind of being created from what existed before, shaped by those with knowledge and intention toward a specific form. Modern scholars read this as mythology, as the universal human story of divine creation, dressed in the specific imagery of ancient Mesopotamian culture, gods making humans from clay, or from the blood of a divine being mixed with earth, or from some other combination of divine and material substance. The imagery varies across different versions of the texts, but the structural element that persists across versions is the mixing, something of divine origin combined with something earthly to produce the human being as it exists. What if this is not only mythology? What if it is a compressed account of a biological encounter, remembered imperfectly, but preserved because the memory was too significant to lose? What if the divine substance in the mixing account represents the genetics of the Anunnaki lineage, whatever that lineage was, being introduced into a population that already existed. And what if the mark of that introduction, the lingering molecular evidence of it, is still visible in the 15% of humanity who lack a protein that every other primate carries? This is speculation. It will remain speculation until and unless ancient DNA research and population genetics can close the gap between the known distribution of Rh-negative blood and a specific population event in prehistoric Europe or the ancient Near East. That gap may close within a generation as the tools improve, or it may not, because the event occurred in a place and time where the physical evidence has been degraded or lost. But the speculation is at least coherent. It fits the shape of the mystery rather than flying past it, and it connects the blood story to the oldest human memory we have in written form. The memory that the Sumerians preserved on their tablets. The memory that shows up in different forms in the Genesis account of the sons of God and the daughters of men. The memory that echoes in Celtic stories of the Tuatha Dé and the Fair Folk. The memory of a time when the boundary between what was fully human and what was something else was not as fixed as it later became. A time when something crossed that boundary and left a mark. The mark may be molecular. The mark may be in the specific configuration of a protein on the surface of a red blood cell. The mark may be what researchers discovered in 1940 and have been studying ever since, without yet finding a fully satisfying explanation for. If you are Rh-negative, you may be carrying that mark right now, circulating in the dark of your own veins, invisible to you, invisible to everyone around you, but visible to the immune system of an Rh-positive partner's fetus, visible to the antibody systems of a transfusion recipient, visible to the researchers who are still asking why it exists and what it means. And if you are Rh-positive, you may be carrying the lineage that met the other one, somewhere in the deep past, in a place no one living can name. You may be the descendant of the crossing, carrying a mix of both origins in your particular combination of expressed and unexpressed genetics. All of us are crossings. All human beings alive today are the product of meetings and mixings that stretch back through more history than any record has preserved. The genetic archaeology is always discovering new layers, new episodes of contact, or new evidence that the story of where we came from is more complicated and more interesting than any simple account allows. Rh-negative blood is one of the clearest single markers of that complexity. One protein, absent from a specific surface, pointing at a question that humanity has been asking in different languages and different frameworks since the first time anyone looked up at the sky and wondered where the people they were descended from had originally come from. Tonight, that question is still open. It may be open for a long time yet. The mystery is intact, and the blood that carries it moves through the hearts of 1 in 7 people on this planet with complete indifference to the mystery it represents, doing its ancient work, carrying oxygen, maintaining warmth, keeping the vast and complicated machinery of being alive running without any assistance from the conscious mind. The oldest question does not need your attention to persist. It will persist whether you think about it or not. It is written in the cells. But tonight, in the quiet, it is worth feeling for a moment. The weight of it, the age of it, the fact that you are connected through an unbroken chain of blood and birth to the moment when whatever happened happened, to the crossing that created the incompatibility, to the population that first carried the absence and passed it to their children and their children's children, down through the long spiral of generations to the people who exist today. You are that far from the beginning. You are that close to it. The blood knows the way, even if the words for it have not yet been found. Let the questions drift now. Let the mystery do what mysteries do in the space before sleep, which is to become something more than a problem to be solved, to become a presence, a quality of the night itself, The particular texture of not knowing something important and being at peace with not knowing, because the not knowing is honest, and honesty is the only solid ground there is. The Anunnaki came from the sky, the tablets say. They walked among people. They left something behind. Whether that something is encoded in the blood of the people who carry a specific absence where all other primates carry a presence is a question that no one has yet answered definitively. But the question is there. It has been there since before there was writing to record it. And tonight it rests in the dark with you. The same way it has rested in every generation that has looked at the sky and wondered, and in every generation of people whose blood carried the mark of whatever it was that once crossed the boundary between what we are and what we were before we were fully what we are now. Sleep well. The blood remembers, even when everything else forgets. There is one more thread worth following before sleep takes you. A thread that connects the molecular details of Rh-negative blood to the larger question of what human civilization is and where it came from, in a way that is different from the Anunnaki question, but that runs alongside it. The agricultural revolution. The shift from hunter-gatherer existence to settled farming that began approximately 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent and spread outward from there across the world, transformed the genetic landscape of humanity more dramatically than any event since the migrations out of Africa. Farming populations grew faster than foraging populations. They displaced, absorbed, and in some cases eliminated the populations they encountered. In Europe, the arrival of early farmers from Anatolia, roughly 9,000 years ago, dramatically reduced the proportion of the indigenous hunter-gatherer genetics in most of the continent. Most, but not all. The populations in the places where farming spread most slowly, where the terrain made large-scale agriculture difficult, where the existing populations were dense and determined enough to resist genetic replacement, retain more of their pre-agricultural heritage. The Atlantic fringe, the mountain refuges, the places where, thousands of years later, researchers would find the highest concentrations of Rh-negative blood. This is not coincidence. This is the same phenomenon expressed in genetic terms. The pre-agricultural Europeans of the Atlantic coast were already carrying unusual blood frequencies that the post-agricultural populations who replaced most of their counterparts elsewhere did not carry, or carried at lower levels. When the farming wave arrived, these populations were partially absorbed but not replaced. Their genes survived in the new mixed population at higher frequencies than in places where the replacement was more complete. What this means is that Rh-negative blood is, in a very real sense, a marker of the pre-agricultural world, of the Europe that existed before the farmers came, of the hunter-gatherer cultures that had been living on the Atlantic coast and in the mountain ranges for thousands of years before any city was built or any field was ploughed. It is a molecular fossil preserved in living people of a way of being human that is mostly gone now, except in these faint genetic echoes. The Basques preserve it most clearly because they were most successful at maintaining their distinctness through the agricultural transition and through every subsequent wave of migration and conquest. They were already there when the farmers arrived. They were already there when the Bronze Age peoples came. They were already there when the Romans conquered Iberia, though they remained, maintaining their language and their genetics and their unusual blood type through 2,000 years of being surrounded by other cultures, other languages, other ways of being in the world. They are, in the most literal possible sense, survivors. The genetic remnant of the world that existed before the world we know began. And if the question of where Rh-negative blood originally came from goes deeper than the pre-agricultural European hunter-gatherers, if it goes back further to whatever those hunter-gatherers themselves descended from, to whatever crossings and contacts and encounters shaped their particular biology in the deep Ice Age past, then the Basques are a window, not just into pre-agricultural Europe, but into something older still. Now into the time when the people who would become the pre-agricultural Europeans first arrived in that part of the world, into the time when they brought with them or acquired through some encounter, the specific blood type that their descendants still carry today. The Aurignacian culture, named for a site in the south of France, represents the earliest clearly modern humans in Europe. They arrived approximately 45,000 years ago, carrying with them advanced stone tools, personal ornaments, bone instruments, cave art. They were anatomically modern. They were cognitively modern. And they were entering a continent that had already been inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years by Neanderthals, who were robust and successful and possessed their own culture and their own long adaptation to the European environment. The two populations coexisted for several thousand years. They interbred, as the DNA of modern Europeans confirms. Most people of European ancestry today carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA, evidence of those ancient crossings. And some researchers have proposed that the specific configuration of certain immune system proteins in modern Europeans, including potentially the Rh system, may reflect aspects of that ancient hybridization. This is speculative in the current state of the science. The ancient DNA evidence is rich enough to confirm that interbreeding happened, but not yet detailed enough to trace specific protein variants to specific population contacts with confidence. The work is ongoing. The data is growing. Within the next decade, the resolution of the ancient DNA record for Europe will be significantly better than it is today, and some of the questions that are currently open may close. Or they may not close in the direction most people expect. The science may confirm the conventional explanation, random mutation, genetic drift, nothing unusual. Or it may reveal something that requires a more complex account, an encounter, a crossing, a biological event that left a mark still visible in the cells of the people who descended from it. Until then, the mystery remains. And the mystery is appropriate to its subject. Blood has always carried more than its physical contents. It has carried meaning in every culture that ever thought about it. The meaning varies, but the sense that blood says something important, something about identity and origin and connection, is universal. Tonight, whatever your blood type, whatever the particular history written in your cells, that blood is doing its quiet, essential, completely unremarkable work, flowing through the chambers of your heart, carrying the oxygen your brain needs to do whatever it is doing right now as sleep approaches, maintaining the temperature that means alive rather than cold, feeding the immune system that stands between you and the vast microbial world that is always pressing against the borders of your body. All of that happens without your awareness, without your direction, without any conscious participation on your part. The blood knows what to do. It has known what to do for longer than human memory reaches. And in the particular configuration of your blood, in the specific proteins present or absent on the surface of your red blood cells, there is a tiny piece of information, a molecular fingerprint, a record of where your particular lineage has been and what it encountered and what it carried forward from those encounters. For most people, that record is unremarkable in a clinical sense. The RhD antigen is present, as it is in most primates, and the blood does its work without complication. For roughly 1 in 7, the antigen is absent, and the blood still does its work, but carries with it a question that science has been asking since 1940. Where does this absence come from? What does it mean that it persists at these frequencies in these specific populations? What ancient crossing created the incompatibility that makes the absence clinically significant? And what were the beings described in the oldest written records of human civilization, the ones who brought knowledge and mixed with humanity and left something behind in the blood of their descendants? The questions are old. They may be older than writing, and they will still be here tomorrow, patient and quiet and unresolved, when the sun comes up and the analytical mind wakes back up and the world returns to its ordinary complexity. But tonight, they can rest. Tonight, the blood can simply move, warm and rhythmic and indifferent to its own mystery. keeping you alive, connecting you to everyone who carried the same particular configuration before you, and to everyone who will carry some version of it after. The Anunnaki, if they existed, are gone now, or transformed beyond recognition. You're all remembered only in the stories that the cultures closest to where they walked have preserved through every catastrophe and conquest, and forgetting that human history has evolved. But the mark they left, if they left one, is still here, circulating, flowing, doing its ancient work in the dark of millions of bodies, patient and persistent and remarkable for being there at all. Let that thought carry you down into sleep. The blood is old. The questions are old. And you are made of both, and you are here, and that is enough. The night holds everything. Sleep.